This week's National Park Service Deep Cut in Surface of Living History comes to us from Vermont. Now, I know we have all pretty much heard of the Appalachian Trail, and I'm sure a fair number of you have even set foot on it. But what if I told you there was an equivalent trail that lets you tour American westward expansion, much the same way that other, more famous trail takes you through the territories of the colonial age? This is the North Country Trail that stretches from Vermont to North Dakota, passing through New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota along the way. For those of you who grew up on Little House on the Prairie books, Laura Ingalls Wilder's problematic views aside, the Wisconsin to North Dakota section is pretty much her childhood, though she ended up in South Dakota. At around 4,800 miles or 7,700 kilometers, it positively dwarfs the approximately 2,200-mile Appalachian Trail. While that trail spends a lot of time avoiding or simply skirts quite a bit of modern civilization, the North Country Trail takes hikers through areas that are wild and far away from the world in ways that most of us rarely see, except from way up above in an airplane. Along with seeing the world at foot speed, walking this trail places hikers alone and away from other people in ways that would have been more typical of voyageurs and the settlers seeking a homestead out west, or can mimic the world railroad workers faced as they labored to make the trackless wilderness, well, tracked. Following the trail, of course, gives you the distinct advantage over those people of the past by providing you with a route to follow. All the same, bring your compass and a current map. The North Country Trail gives people a chance to see the West that was, before West meant the coast, and this all became the middle. And very importantly, it offers a glimpse of how thousands of people, for thousands of years, the First Nations of Native Americans, saw these lands as a home that provided food, shelter, and a place to simply be. Episode 94, Changes to Sugar World. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at how the U.S., being its very own country, upended the Atlantic sugar trade, and how the table was set for America's 20th century sugar shenanigans, because there were a lot. But let's look at how it got that way. So pull up to your place at the table, and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that before the Revolutionary War, all the cane sugar eaten in the North American British colonies arrived by boat. There was no sugar industry on the North American continent under British control. Most of us have likely read stories that explain people having sweet things by having them find wild honey, or stories where people kept bees so they had sweet stuff that way. Then there's the practice of tapping trees, mainly maple, so people could also have sweets. But the amount of sweets provided by honey and maple and even birch and alder sugar were dwarfed, snowed under, utterly obliterated by the sugar provided by cane sugar and molasses. Ships full of barrels of brown sugar and molasses and chests of paper-wrapped sugar loaf cones arrived at the docks from Maine to Georgia. They were rolled into shops, onto wagons that would head for the western edges and out to the plantations. The molasses would also go to the distilleries lining the wharves and docksides of Boston, Newport, Rhode Island, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. With this river of sugar in colonial and earliest America, all other sources of sweets were really only moved about locally and were generally considered inferior. Just as with our own cookbooks, the cookbooks of the era that could be found in England and America during this period do not mention maple sugar as a sugar source, and honey makes few appearances. A New England pamphlet here or there might make mention of maple sugar and maple molasses, the contemporary term for maple syrup. It was generally seen as an inferior substitute when real sugar was not available. It was what those wild, hairy weirdos eking out a living in the tall trees of Vermont were putting on their coarse fire cakes and brewing into strange flavored beers. Maple was not yet a flavor that was advertised as a way to make food more desirable for most people. Cinnamon sugar donuts and gingerbread, yes. But maple bars, no. Honey would often appear as a wholesome medical additive. It was used in mixtures to treat coughs, sore throats, even in plasters for wounds, and in various tinctures for all manner of ailments. Instructions for making mead and metheglin, which is a Welsh version of mead, they appeared as well. Though by the end of the 18th century and into the 19th, American recipes for metheglin started to view it more as a medicine, not a refreshment. It was to be found in the medicine sections of cookbooks as a highly spiced mishmash imbued with some mystical healing powers. In many ways, it became one of the first popular, quote, secret recipes with secret healing powers passed down from my great-great-grandmother from the old country, unquote, items. But mead hung on for a good long time as a popular and was even considered a wholesome type of brewed beverage. Wine was still scarce, being imported at great price, or brewed locally from all manner of fruits, and thus was frequently of indifferent quality. But honey, unlike ripe or lightly rotted fruit, it's of a steady, dependable quality, especially since it's being made by bees, all working from more or less the same biochemistry rules. And due to its low water content, it won't rot. Well, literally, it cannot rot. As a result, it made a base for dependably tasty wine of pretty steady quality. Honey and tree sugars, maple, birch, and alder syrups, these were alternate forms of sweet besides cane sugar, but they were not economically important. For the most part, they were made for local trade and did not travel far beyond their local origins of production. So when it came to sweet, what really mattered in American food was sugar and the molasses squeezed from the sugar cane that was planted, harvested, and processed at the cost of thousands of human lives every year. The sugar islands of the Caribbean fed the growing American sweet tooth and built new fortunes of fantastical size for just a few men and their families. During the 18th century, there had been a massive maneuvering by the big sea powers as they worked to solidify the sugar empires they had set up along the edges of the Atlantic Ocean in the 17th century. The Portuguese and the Spanish had old sugar properties off the coasts of Europe and Africa, and some new ones on the American side. When Spain found a literal mountain of silver in what is now Potosi, Bolivia, they ditched many of their agricultural plans for the New World and concentrated on simply digging up literal money instead of growing it. But the Portuguese built their empire of sugar in Brazil. The Dutch would claim several of the islands and a few coastal communities along the northern edge of South America and produce some sugar there in their colony of Suriname. France would establish a foothold next to Suriname and Guyana, but the majority of the French sugar and coffee and riches would all flow out of Saint-Domingue. When they'd shoved the Spanish off half the island Columbus had claimed almost 300 years earlier. The English had set up all manner of outposts which developed into sugar plantations and trading ports all over the Caribbean. Bermuda, Barbados, Jamaica, and selections of the Bahamas, the Virgin Islands, the Windwards, and the Leewards. Many of the smaller outposts and ports would change hands from the Spanish to the French to the English and back again over a period of 200 years or so. By the end of the 18th century, the big ports were more or less settled as to who owned what. The smallest outposts would remain completely up for grabs because they were so poor, so bereft of water and shelter that they were mainly left as pirate outposts or places to go hunt Spanish cows and pigs that had gone feral and torn up any native vegetation that didn't have thorns or wasn't poisonous. Which meant that in the last few decades in the run-up to the Revolutionary War, most of the sugar that was eaten in North America was coming from Jamaica and Barbados, though a healthy proportion was also smuggled in from Dutch and French ports. Very little came from Brazil because it was frankly too far away. I mean, you had to cross the doldrums, this zone around the equator that regularly lacked any good wind. So why bother when sugar, along with lemons and pineapples and nutmeg, were all to be had in the Caribbean? Because taxes and duties and tariffs for English molasses were always in flux and particularly maddening to the continental merchants, lots of French and Dutch product was regularly intermingled into what was called British. But then, America went to war with Britain. Twice. What were we to do for sugar? In round one, during the War of Independence, it was pretty easy. By fighting the British, it made the French and Dutch love us, or at least happy or even joyous to take American money. Or at least money spent by the new Americans, as there was no American money per se. It was all British pounds, French livres, Prussian thalers, Dutch florins, Spanish dollars, Portuguese reis, and a general assortment of gold, silver, and copper coins from here and there about the world. As the Revolutionary War broke out, the launching of shipping by continental captains wasn't really hampered. If anything, more ships were launched to get them out of the way of the British Navy swarming the major ports. But some were captured by the British Navy, and many had a tough time getting back to the major basins where all the ports were in New England, the Chesapeake Bay or the Georgia-South Carolina river mouths. This was an annoying but temporary condition. In fact, within a decade after the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, trade was at the same levels with Britain, if not higher than they had been in 1775. Of course, there was always going to be a few hiccups as push and pull and push occurred with the French. But then, something happened in the Caribbean in 1791 that would alter sugar world forever. The Haitian Revolution. For details on this complex, distressing, depressing, and world-altering event, I cannot recommend Mike Duncan's Revolution series highly enough. It's season 4. Up until then, Saint-Domingue was the most lucrative colony in the world, but like Barbados, one of the most deadly. Most of the people who had been purchased in Africa and survived the horrific voyage across the Atlantic, few of them would survive more than 7 years growing cane or growing coffee. A particular mixture of greed, cruelty, complex and inconsistently applied code noir, the waves of revolution in France, yellow fever, malaria, and of course even more greed and cruelty all serve to bring to the boil the suffering and heartbreak that lay at the bottom of the fortunes made in Saint-Domingue. In the end, Saint-Domingue broke from France and reemerged as Haiti, an independent nation that would be a thorn in the side of the empires run on the blood of humans brought from Africa and later Asia and India that surrounded this new nation. But that will be Haiti's future. In the years of early America, Haiti's revolt upended Caribbean sugar production and forced a rearranging of the Atlantic world. And we should not overlook that a desire for revenge, rather than reconciliation or progress, would mark that new world order. In the new American kitchens, the Revolutionary War caused a series of hiccups in access to sugar. There were local shortages on and off for a decade, largely due to war being annoying and getting in the way of stuff. But once the ink dried and the dust settled, the sugar system before and after the war was pretty much the same. But with the Haitian Revolution, the sugar system suffered a huge crack. Most of the sugar from Saint-Domingue had gone back to Europe, to France obviously, but a fair bit went to America, some to Spain, and the northern parts of the Mediterranean world. There are also sugar plantations on the Canary Islands, on Cyprus, here and there in North Africa, in the Levant, and in India. And these provided much of the sugar supply to North Africa, East Africa, and Indonesia, and even East Asia. But these parts of the world did not hunger for sugar the way Europe, especially Western Europe, did. So these areas had little interaction with the Atlantic sugar world. European sugar was very centralized and limited in what processes were used to make sugar and what kinds of sugar products were available. In the 17th century, white granulated sugar from sugar cane was decided upon as the best sugar. Thus, the processes to make it became more or less the only ways to make sugar. There are stops along the way to making white granulated sugar that produces grades of brown sugar. These are considered second best, and then of course molasses was a shameful third, and that was more or less it. But the rest of the world came up with hundreds of different ways to make, cook with, and consume sugar that were invisible to or lost from Europe and America. I'll go into these in more depth when each of these cuisines makes its way on to the American plate. But it's worth noting that if you go into any grocery store that is not aimed at regular American food, the sugar section is full of wonders. There are palm sugars of South Asia and Oceania, many shades and grades of sugar to be found in the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the rock and stick and brick sugars commonly found in Chinese and Korean groceries. Brazil, Argentina, Costa Rica, Suriname, Cuba, and Mexico all have sugars of various richness, graininess, and caramel suggestions. North Africa and the Middle East lean towards the American traditions of just white and brown granulated sugar, since, after all, they are the source of the sugar technologies Europe took to the Atlantic islands. Here in America, at the start, we had decided more or less there would be only one sort of sugar, and so we lost so much other art. But back where we were, when Haiti said enough, it temporarily broke the Atlantic sugar trade. Though there was plenty of other sugar in the world and many other ways to make and enjoy sugar, they were functionally invisible to the European and American sugar markets. And possibly more important, they didn't work in the sugar is to make money mill that had been set up around the Atlantic. To keep their hold on the sugar money machine, the European sugar world started setting up shop with the same methods, but in new places. For many of the planters from ex-Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, there were two preferred destinations, South Carolina and Louisiana. South Carolina has played host to relocating French people multiple times. In the 17th century, when early fights over Caribbean islands had caused a ruckus, and they took in some refugees in the Grand Dérangement relocations caused by Britain taking over the maritime provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick that had once been known as Acadia. Yes, the Acadia I just talked about recently. That origin point of what would become the Maine Acadians and the Louisiana Cajuns. I know, learning that groups of people in Maine and Louisiana have a common origin is just as disorienting as learning about the red-haired, bagpipe-playing Celts that inhabit mountainous regions of Spain and claim ancient kinship with the Scots and the Irish. Human migrations can be weird. Anyway, the planters that moved to South Carolina were largely thwarted when it came to reestablishing sugar plantations. The climate was just as wrong for the crop at the end of the 18th century as it was in the 17th. Though some sugar planting was established in the southern low-lying regions of Georgia, where it was just that bit warmer and there was adequate groundwater. But those that moved to the Louisiana Territory, they found a hospitable climate for sugarcane growing. So it was here, at the end of the 18th century, that the areas feeding into the port of New Orleans would start to host serious sugar plantations. Part of the climate was the weather and adequate fresh water, but of course there was also the racial climate. The use of importing enslaved people to work in inhumanely harsh conditions was accepted as the way to bring a cash crop to market. The Code Noir of French Louisiana and later Spanish law that governed enslaved people made this possible. It initially created a system that was a bit more stable than the permanent chattel slavery black codes of British colonies and America. Because these laws were more likely to curtail the most egregious abuses and provided pathways to freedom through self-purchase, just this little bit of hope was enough to reduce the threat of slave rebellion. Of course, what was written as law and what was enacted, there was quite a bit of divergence. Now, if you're wondering about Florida, because it became the home of much American sugar before the conquest of Hawaii, it's not in the sugar game yet. Florida at this time is firmly Spanish. There's plenty of fruit and a healthy plantation and mission culture, but the earthworks that will be necessary to kickstart the sugar industry have not yet happened. Instead, for the Spanish, Cuba was where the sugar was grown. In fact, when the troubles began in Haiti, some of the slack was taken up by the Spanish in Cuba by, yay, great, returning to the practice of once again importing enslaved people to expand and work their sugar fields. They were also willing to overlook America's threatening gazes at Florida for a time, for a chance to sell them more sugar. Though, real talk here, America is seriously eyeing Florida and will start encroaching in Spanish territories every chance it gets. Good Cuban sugar prices or not, whatever. Anyway, sugar in America got more expensive there for a while. Granted, by the 1790s, most Americans were buying sugar from the British Caribbean. But with the loss of much of the Haitian sugar, there was simply more competition for the British and Dutch and emerging Spanish sugar, so sugar was still rarer and cheaper during this time in America, until the Louisiana plantations were up and running. And then, with the purchase of the Port of New Orleans and the Louisiana Territory in 1803, well, the South and the expanding states and territories of the Appalachians, they tied into the trade on the Mississippi River. So these places had their sugar supply pretty well tied up. As with the Atlantic sugar trade, which depended on the winds, if your sugar supply came north on the Mississippi River, it also ended up being seasonal. There were parts of the year when going up the river was foolishness. Winter, of course, was a disaster. Rain made parts impassable due to mud and flooding, and further up the river, ice and lack of grass for grazing made passage north a fool's errand. And of course, early spring was no good for coming north. There was still little grass for grazing, and the current downstream was strong, full of the melting snows of winter. So sugar, along with any number of foodstuffs that might be imported from Louisiana into the growing West, the season to import a fresh batch to fill up depleted supplies was late spring to early autumn. The river current downstream was its lightest, so any mules or donkeys that were pulling barges had plenty of forage, and places for camping along the river were dry. But once the autumn rains arrived, from then on, all traffic was downstream with the current. Besides, upstream had products it wanted to bring downstream, mainly harvested crops in the fall and trapped winter furs in the spring. With the inclusion of the Port of New Orleans into the United States, Caribbean sugar would become the sugar of mostly the East Coast and the lands east of the Appalachian Range. Once the sugar markets had sorted themselves out after the declaration of the nation of Haiti in 1804, things would roll along and work out pretty well until the War of 1812. Now, with the ownership of islands and ports and markets mostly settled in the Atlantic sugar world, there was much less of an alternate sugar market if you didn't want to deal with the British. There was no Saint-Domingue as there had been in 1776. Sure, Cuba had spun up operations, the Dutch were still around, but the Cubans were still pretty small potatoes and the Dutch were pretty far away compared to the British Caribbean sugar and what was now Haiti. Sure, for the very richest people, they were getting their sugar all the way from Madeira in the eastern Atlantic, along with their wine. But for most people who had been getting Caribbean sugar, if anything, the United States suffered a larger disruption of its sugar supplies during the War of 1812 than it did in the Revolutionary War. This really was due to the fact that simply more people were eating more sugar than they had been in 1776, so lots more people felt the squeeze. The Continental Navy in the 1770s and 1780s wasn't much, but American shipping had exploded in the years since then, going to China, to New Spain, venturing into the Mediterranean, and roving everywhere in search of whales, while also plying the now familiar roads to the British ports. So when America declared war on Britain in 1812, the British Navy was all too eager to capture these fast, well-built, and newer Yankee ships of all sorts and induct them into the British fleet. Hundreds of ships had headed down to the Caribbean before the war was declared, full of salt cod, salt beef, butter, rice, and salt pork. They were planning on returning with their annual shipment of British sugar, molasses, rum, and nutmeg, but they found themselves prisoners instead. With the redistribution of these ships and their stores, an entire season of sugar imports were interrupted, and they would not happen the next year, and many of them would not even happen the next. getting Louisiana sugar down and around the Florida Peninsula through the pirate-infested string of islands known as the Keys, and then up through the British blockades, harrying American shipping was nobody's idea of fun. And with adequate markets for Louisiana sugar west of the Appalachians in the new settlements in Kentucky, Tennessee, and the areas that would eventually become Ohio, Texas, and any number of states along the Mississippi River, no one was particularly excited to haul sugar back east over mountain passes. Maple syrup may have had its first moment in the sun during the Revolutionary War when boycotts of British sugar and tea became quite fashionable. But it was really during the War of 1812, when so many more people felt real sugar shortages, that maple molasses and maple sugar really started to emerge as a proud American product. It was one thing for everyone in Boston and Philadelphia to publicly proclaim that they weren't using British sugar anymore in 1776. It was something else entirely in 1813, when that year's sugar shipment largely hadn't arrived, and then didn't come the next year either. That, combined with the stretching out of the country along the Great Lakes, more land with more sugar maple trees was occupied by these new Americans as they gleefully broke every last treaty that had been made by the British and French crowns with all the tribes along the colonial frontier. I mean, Daniel Boone's foray through the Cumberland Gap and through the Appalachian Range in 1776 was partly motivated by the fact that King George's treaties just didn't apply to us new Americans. So it was this lack of British sugar combined with a greater access to maple sugar, especially to those on the frontier as settlers and soldiers, that brought maple sugar forward as an American sweetener, and one that wasn't subject to those pesky British and their moods. The types of sweets that were popular in the 18th century, Dutch-inspired cookies, spice cakes, fruit cakes, egg custards, bread puddings, syrup, and liquor-preserved fruits, were just as popular in this period as before the Revolutionary War. But this new maple syrup and maple molasses started to be added as a flavoring as much as a sweetener. Rice pudding was emerging as a favorite sweet in the rice-growing regions of the southern states, especially in the Carolinas. So as rice became a popular status ingredient in New England, maple-sweetened rice puddings, in a pie crust or just in a buttered dish, started to appear. Now, rice pudding in a crust may seem strange or excessive, but remember, the crust in the dish was there to protect the pudding from scorching on the bottom as much as it was there to be eaten. Temperature control in these days of no or only the most rudimentary ovens was always a chancy thing. And quite often, a hotter than ideal temperature was often how baking started. The oven was heated at the beginning and the coals were removed. All an oven did at this time was cool down over a period of hours. There was no steady maintained heat as we think of it today. Another popular application of maple syrup was on a cornmeal-based sweet known as Indian pudding, which I'll explain in detail next week. In its original incarnation, it had been topped with molasses. But with the original sweetener in short supply, it became common to top this pudding with maple syrup instead. So in the face of shortages of its founding sweetener, cane sugar, America decides it does love this homegrown syrup. But with the end of the War of 1812, which actually happened before the Battle of New Orleans, but nobody in America cared about that, to us, the battle proved we'd actually won the war as far as we were concerned. Anyway, with the end of that war, America came out of it with easier access to new sugar, the same access to old sugar, and now with maple sugar to boot. Life was getting sweeter all the time. Now, glass jars, canning technology, and all of a sudden paraffin wax are on the horizon. Jams and jellies are soon going to take this country by storm, but not quite yet. It's still ceramic jars of potted conserves for now. Next week, it's corn during these war years, hasty pudding, Boston brown bread, and yes, Indian pudding. Since soldiers of this era were fed by voluntary contributions from each colony or state, and the lowest bidder, you'd better believe it that it was often cornmeal over wheat in soldierly rations. But there were other ways to deal with a corn crop during the unstable war years, and we'll learn all about that as well. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles, along with cool book recommendations, will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. If you haven't yet, please take a quick moment to leave a review of this podcast on your favorite podcast widget. It makes me more visible to the food and history curious alike. And thanks to those of you who've already left a review. You can find me on a variety of social medias as THoAFood, and if you want a really different view of the 19th century in a more freewheeling format, you can join me on my new podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters, with my co-host, Jamie Lewis. Right now, we are firmly in the midst of reviewing Season 1 of the extremely exciting Kung Fu Cowboy show, Warrior. It's all fighting, food, fashion, and crime. You get cowboys and Kung Fu. It's an exciting show. Come join us. And I'll be joining a huge lineup of other history podcasters this year at Intelligent Speech Online to talk about contingencies in the face of things that did not go to plan. I'll be talking about butter substitutes and leading a panel on what women did when they found themselves out of nice lady territory. That is, their manhood died. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and all this information and more can be found in the show description.